Hi Christian, the new season is finally upon us. How are you and how are you feeling for QPR's upcoming campaign?
Hey Con, I'm good. Thanks so much for your time today. Good. I mean, it's always incredibly exciting moment when you spend weeks and months thinking about that kind of first competitive game of the season, and then you blink, preseason goes, and you're right in front of it. So everyone's worked really hard. It's been probably one of the most demanding preseasons on the players physically for several seasons at this club. I think from a loads perspective, we're probably up about 20%. Um, and that means we've got lots of good football content in. And I think it's the right time to do it because ultimately, you know, as well as I do, the sweeping nature of the championship season, 17 plus 3 game weeks. This is the moment to get all that in. And so boys have really enjoyed training. I think they've made that pretty clear as well in some of the interviews and stuff. So it's a great atmosphere at the moment in the training ground, and everyone's excited to get stuck into 25, 26.
Great, it's good to hear. Now, before we get into the summer and the season ahead, I wanted to start briefly by reflecting on last season, your first full season at QPR, and one with plenty of highs and lows. So, what were your biggest takeaways and lessons from 24-25, both on and off the pitch?
I think I think in many ways a lot of what we had assumed played out, but perhaps not in the order that we hoped it would. Um, we felt that the quality of league last season was necessarily weaker than the season before, and I think it's certainly going to be weaker than this season coming, and therefore felt it was the right environment and moment to bring in players that we felt could contribute at a championship level after a period of adaptation. Significantly, I think we saw that, you know, one of the major lessons that we've definitely learned as a whole football club has been the necessity to find the right balance for medical and coaching staff on rotation of players, because a lot of the injury issues that we had last season, um, regardless of whether they were muscular or not, one injury would happen in a certain position, and then the guy who wasn't playing for 3 or 4 weeks would then come in and potentially also get injured, and then that's how we had some issues in certain positions where we had multiple people injured at the same time. I think on a personal level, I've learned that we've got a group of really aspirational staff, and it's an absolute pleasure every single day to work with them and be in this building with them, and a real determination from everybody to overcome adversity. Adversity is not a nice thing for from a football perspective, anyone to go through a long period without a win. It's definitely not nice for the fans, and we apologize for some of those that happened last season. But also, you know, internally that can be really difficult and tough on people. And the resilience that was shown in the really difficult moments by the playing group, by support staff, was awesome and energizing, and I think really had a big impact. So that's great. And I think we've certainly seen that a lot of the processes that we put in place at the beginning of last season, we were able to start to see how they were working, and you know how we needed to tweak those. I think from a player pathway perspective, the journey Emerson Sutton went on last season, I know I've mentioned it before, but really like a very interesting one and a good blueprint of what we want to achieve. Someone at 17 who goes on loan in non-league, has that experience, does well in the kind of more premier academy competitions, and then towards the end of the season has an opportunity with the first team, and then had the full preseason obviously with the first team this season. I think that's been something internally that we've really liked, and where it's appropriate and where we have the right players to do so, want to try to emulate as much as possible. So yeah, I mean, hopefully that's a decent summary.
Yeah, thank you. Now, Julien Stéphan was confirmed as QPR's new head coach at the end of June. What can you tell us about that recruitment process that led to his appointment?
I think, the reality is as a championship club, you always need to have a sense of direction, because sometimes in football unexpected things happened. It happened. It's been the case for the football club in the past that the coach has done really, really well and they've had interest, and all of a sudden the club maybe has been in a position where they need to find a replacement. And we don't want to ever be in a situation where we are scrambling for that. And so, our data and recruitment team are always looking at how, different teams, and then necessarily when you're watching different teams, you're watching different coaches as well, and how they work. But also the game model concept means that we very quickly, clearly have an idea of coaches that we think stylistically can deliver um, similar style of football. And so, a lot of that work just exists, or databases have been built up within the club over the last 18 months. So when we were in a situation where, all of a sudden there was a change in that department, the guys were ready. And then it was about really focusing hard to look at some of the things that were really, really important to us as a football club in terms of what we're trying to achieve. Success in integrating and working in developing young players was key. Success in managing squads through 3 game weeks was key. Um, the knowledge as well of the importance of specialization within a coaching staff and being comfortable to work with that. Being excited by the concept of working with someone like Steve Bald and being able to lean on his experience rather than, maybe not embracing it. And there's not a criticism of coaches that wouldn't want to embrace it. It's an incredibly stressful job, and everyone has their own way of doing things. We just want to be a football club where everybody collaborates to find the best solution to whatever problem we're facing on the football side, rather than necessarily titles, meaning that the best idea has to come from the person with the most senior title, and that absolutely goes for myself and everyone on the non-football side of the business also. So the guys, and it was a group of Andy Belker's head of recruitment, John D'Souza's head of methodology, Mike Maynard's head of performance services, and Ben um, did a lot of work to look at their various areas of expertise to understand each potential candidate as to their viability and whether there could be a fit. Looking at stuff like injury history and types of injury that coaches have seen in the squads that they've previously coached, understanding the experience of coaches working in a collaborative way from a player recruitment perspective. And then organizationally and culturally, uh, how those individuals are from a behavioral perspective. I think we're trying to build a very direct culture here. So if there's a problem, and as long as it's like brought up respectfully, then we want to be as direct as possible with that problem. And it can be a small thing about one member of staff telling other member of staff, like, I don't think that this was the best way to react in this situation to this scenario, or it can be much, much bigger things. And the reason why it's really important, if you want to have that culture in a football club, to ensure that the head coach also has that approach, is that you, like, necessarily the championship's crazy and things happen that people don't expect internally and externally. And so football clubs can waste a lot of time with sort of not getting to a place where key decision makers are sitting down and just trying to deal with issues rather than letting them kind of bubble along for a longer period of time, which creates apathy that just isn't good for anyone. It isn't good for the players who just want clarity in terms of what they're doing, and it isn't good in terms of building relationships across groups of staff. So those were the kind of key criteria and key parameters that were looked at. And ultimately the club identified 6 or 7 individuals that we felt were very exciting, had a level of interest in joining the football club, and we could have worked with a number of them, and in the end, we ultimately felt that of all the criteria that we laid out, and then also obviously keeping in mind our financial reality as a football club, that Julien was absolutely the best person to lead the club forward as head coach.
Now, moving on to player recruitment, there's been four additions to the first team playing squad so far. Three of those four signings were already playing in the EFL, which feels like quite a contrast to last summer's business. Was that a deliberate focus going into this window? And how did the club go about identifying priorities for this summer period?
Sure. I mean, is it different to last summer in the sense of, I guess there were so far this summer we've not had many profiles who haven't experienced English football before. But last summer in Kadi Dembele and Liam Morrison, you had two who were in League One before. So far this summer we've had um, in Ruman, Amadou, and Kwame, three who have experienced League One, and obviously both Amadou and Kwame with a sprinkling of Championship as well in Peterborough's last season in the league. So we're not looking so much this summer consciously necessarily in the sense of having experience in the EFL is a prerequisite for you being successful, because I'm sure you and I could name 50 signings that championship teams have made in the last 5 years from the EFL that haven't worked out for whatever reason. So, is it a factor that is something that we think about and consider this summer? Yes, just like it was last summer. I think probably what is different about the recruitment this summer is that when we tried to strip back the situation we were in last summer, which was really, to be honest, we had 11 or 12 first team players leave, majority out of contract. So it really was a kind of opportunity to try to reset the squad. We tried to think long and hard about the style of football that has been successful in the championship over a long period of time, and also the style of football that QPR fans want to see and like to see. And I've yet to meet a QPR fan who's come up to me in the stadium or elsewhere and said, we don't. Everyone tells me like, that there's this thing around having Mavericks that get you out of your seat, and that being something that like fans want to see and enjoy seeing. So if that fits within a strategy that hopefully still allows you to win football games, that's very much been the priority. So I say all of this to say that last summer it was very much about trying to ensure that we had the technical base to be able to have the ball, build and create chances. And whether it was Caddy or Nico or Liam, who people will maybe say, well, what's Liam got to do with being creative? But his line breaking passes and ability on the ball is a really strong strength of his game. That was very much the focus around it. And now I think there's been more of a focus this summer to try to add on top of that a level of pace, power, and athleticism that will allow two things. Hopefully, one, the team to play slightly higher up the pitch, but then also, second of all, a situation where you just have to accept that the league is heading in that direction. Every year, teams in the championship are running more. Every year, teams in the championship are having more injuries also. And so ensuring that you have players who have athleticism and robustness, which is not the same thing at all, but is a kind of a very, very nice sort of two types of qualities to have, certainly is going to help the club. And then finally, in a 25-man squad, you need enough of a variety of weapons as a coaching staff to be able to try and tackle all the different football tactical problems that opponents will put in front of you in any given season. If you were a top five, top six budget team, you could be absolutely dogmatic in that we're going to approach every game near enough in the same fashion because we believe in our abilities and our qualities. And the reality for QPR is that at times we will need to be able to be versatile to maximize the points that we want to get, whilst maintaining a strong identity that still hopefully allows us, especially at home, to be a more dominant team than we were last season.
Are there more to come ahead of the 1st of September transfer deadline? I know QPR haven't brought in any loans so far. Is that a market that you intend to utilise again?
I mean, I think I've been on the record before in saying that the loan market is, maybe perhaps sometimes a bit of a necessary evil. If you're not a football club that has a budget where you can go out and sign seven or eight players permanently, then the loan market can be great and mutually beneficial for the loan club in terms of ourselves and in adding good quality to the squad, but also for the club that is loaning the player because they want them to have development. And we've built in a short space of time good relationships with City Football Group through the Koki Saito deal with Tottenham as well, with Yang Min Hyuk. So I'm not ruling out the possibility that we may look there again. In terms of whether there will be more signings, we'll see. All I can say is that, as I said last week in the fans forum, we're working hard as much as possible within the realities of our budget to give the club and the fans the most competitive squad possible, but crucially also not bringing players in over the top of players that we think can develop and can quickly get up to the speed and level of the championship.
Now, on the topic of loans, I'm interested in the club's stance on loaning players out. You mentioned back in January that your ambition is to have young players in and around the first team at 18. You've already mentioned Emerson Sutton as a player that, really benefited on that sort of non-league loan and got that sort of pathway to the team at the end of last season. Has that sort of stance changed now that we're really prioritising youth having access to the first team route?
No, I think it's often, I think we just look at it as a much more proactive way to help them get there if they're not there. So if it's someone like, Ridwan Hassan last season who at 16 went out on loan, Emmett at 17, the 16 to 18-year-olds who we think need to get, men's football and physically go up against fully grown men, um, and also experience an environment where they have to play differently in order to win. It's not just an academy environment or playing up against a bunch of 18s. We think that's unbelievably valuable, and so a big part of the work that Alex Carroll is leading now is building relationships with teams up and down the different steps, and also in the National League to ensure that we start to have continuous homes and places for these young players to go on loan. So, I think you will see in the coming weeks that a number of, as the National League market really kind of fires up, you will see a number of our younger players again going to other clubs on initial 3-month loans to try to give them that experience. And then, there's probably a secondary loan opportunity for us, which is for players who we as a club, constantly need to make difficult decisions. What is the best way to maximize a player's potential and value? And sometimes being the third or fourth choice uh, striker or winger and getting 400 or 500 minutes in the first team at QPR this season, that might not be the best plan for player A. And actually, it would be better that they go on loan to League One or League Two, be a key part of that structure, get 2,500 plus minutes under their belt, either to develop and come back stronger and be able to affect the first team in a better way, or ultimately, as was the case obviously this summer with Charlie Kelman, put themselves in a situation where they attract teams that are able to offer the football club a transfer fee and allow the football club to make a profit on those players. And like I said again at the fans forum, that is the only way in which our playing budget is going to increase over the next 2, 3, 4 years. So I think there's probably a dual loan strategy there. And then obviously there is a small minority of players who may be in a situation where they have 1 year left on their deal in the dev squad and ultimately are unlikely, we feel, to make that step up to first team football at QPR. And in that situation, we want to work with those players to give them what we would call an exit loan if a club doesn't yet want to take the chance on them permanently, but wants to try them out or see how they do, then obviously we want to be very proactive in helping those guys. And I have to say, big credit to Alex Carroll, especially on that third point, because he, really cares deeply and passionately about ensuring that whatever an academy kid and however many years an academy kid is given to the football club, it's the right thing to do to activate all of our resources and network to ensure that we proactively help them get a club in the event that we're not going to keep them here, and also continue to check in with them, periodically for a period of months and sometimes even years thereafter, which I think is definitely not something that most football clubs do, and is a credit to him, but also the general culture that we're building at the club.
A young player that's received a lot of minutes in pre-season so far is Joe Walsh, and that's led to a lot of fan debate as to whether he succeeds Paul Nardi as our new number one next season. Is that a situation that you're able to shed any light on?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think the only person that picks the team at this football club is the head coach, and obviously people will see over the coming weeks yeah, which players are getting more minutes or less minutes at the start of the season. I think we're super lucky in the building to have two really strong goalkeepers in Joe Walsh and Paul Nardi, and I thought Joe was excellent against Brentford last week. You know, ultimately, it's a question of trying to, again, with our situation, trying to have as many positions as possible where you have a really high level of competition. Because if you've got two players that are very close to each other from a level perspective, or feel that mutual respect with each other in that position, then the training level or intensity in which they train goes up, and the level of competition hopefully makes them both better players. So I think both Paul and Joe have been great and done great in the period of time that I've been at the football club, and I'm sure they're going to keep pushing each other all the way.
Now, earlier in the interview, you touched on injuries as a key part of last season. In the fan forum last week, Ben Williams mentioned that 45% of our injuries were non-contractile and therefore unpreventable, ultimately putting sort of most of that down to bad luck. So, given that, are there going to be any changes next season to how the club approaches sort of injury prevention and treatment, or are you assured in sort of the processes that are in place?
Look, I think every coaching staff or coaching style will have a different methodology, and they will focus on uh, certain ways of training. And so we as a club have to have some key performance or medical principles that we think are best in order to minimize injury, but also maximize, you know, football content and training time to the best possibility. And that's an unbelievably difficult balance to strike. Like all over the EFL and the Premier League and top five leagues, you've got people trying to figure out what's the best possible equilibrium to find in order to achieve that. And the only way through that is constant collaboration and coaching staff and performance staff working well together to help the coaching staff achieve what their, you know, performance priorities or football objectives are, and then also ensure that at the same time that is being balanced with ensuring that players stay fresh, because we know that is one of the most important things in this league. If you can stay physically, but perhaps even more importantly, mentally fresh as a player in the championship, the chances of you being able to perform well on a you know, sometimes three times a week are exponentially higher. So obviously we reviewed and reflected on everything that happened last season. It is true that we had a number of meniscal tears, knee injuries, which required surgery. We've reflected on whether or not that was due to a lot of training in very small spaces. And you know, certainly performance department and coaching staff have looked at that together in this preseason, and looked at, you know, how training might be adapted in case there is something in relation to that we can try to minimize um, from a meniscal perspective. And then in terms of muscular injuries, you know, we were unfortunately very much par for the course in the championship last season. And I think, you know, what I've sort of challenged um, the performance and coaching staff to this season is, you know, that on its own sounds like, okay, we were average for the league. The difference is we just have less first team squad players than, you know, some of the bigger teams will. So them having five or six players injured at any one point has less of an impact on them than it would if, you know, we were in that situation. So, you know, the objective is always to attempt to be the best we can possibly be in every domain, and that includes ensuring that we have players that are available, but also finding the right balance in terms of ensuring in this preseason, especially, that players have had enough football content under a new head coach who wants them to, you know, be able to play the way he wants to see his teams play. So, you know, we have had some personnel changes across physiotherapy and rehab after, you know, assessing what we did and didn't achieve last season. Mainly because being average in this area is not something that we want to aspire to. We want to be good, if not leading, in the context of the championship in terms of number of injuries. And then the other thing as well is, and it's something that fans don't talk so much about, but the reality is, if you have an older squad, generally speaking, you have a more injury-prone squad. Like it just ultimately with the attrition of championship football, that's just the case, because if you've been injured in a certain muscular site before, the likelihood or increased risk of re-injury there is more significant. And therefore, simply by having had a longer professional career, you've had more of a chance to get injured, and therefore you have a higher probability of actually being injured. And so, that's another big part of the work that we've done in terms of trying to bring the average age of the squad down as well, to be in a position and a spot where, we have more players who are more available more of the time.
I wanted to move on to your role as CEO now and the club's sort of broader strategy. In the past, I think there's been some misconceptions that your position was perhaps a CEO slash director of football hybrid. You mentioned in the fan forum last week that the club operates without a director of football. So, are you able to clarify that point? And given there is no director of football right now, is there any intention to add one in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, it's probably I can see from a fan perspective, like this notion of a director of football, because obviously the club historically had one and now no longer has one, it probably feels more significant than maybe it is. I mean, I don't know this, by heart, but certainly people who are looking into this, or if it's a topic that you cover, I would encourage you to look at all the other championship teams and see how many people with the title of director of football exist at the moment. I don't know, but I would imagine it's probably if it's probably around half, if not less than half. So every club is working in a different structure, and ultimately the model that we have adopted, which I've been on the record to say before, is probably more of a continental model, is rather than having a director of football type role, we have senior leaders that with a lot more individual responsibility specialize to what they're really best at. So Andy Belker's head of recruitment has a role where he's obviously engaging with agents and preliminarily is doing a lot of that information gathering and putting together presentations, and other bits and pieces to make to those agents to make the case that X or Y player should join us. Um, in John D'Souza, from a head of methodology perspective, you kind of have your reference point for everything technical from a football perspective. So he is supporting all of the coaches up and down the structure, including Julien, and having those conversations about how can we put all of our coaching staff in the best possible conditions to succeed. There are a number of football clubs that don't have or haven't had historically a head of performance or a head of performance services like Mike, who's very much focused now on everything in terms of availability from a first team perspective and also strengthening and conditioning. And that's something again that he deserves a lot of credit for. I think on a lot of the groin strength, hamstring strength, and then core upper body muscle tests that we do, our players have become between something like 4 to 7% stronger, depending on the player, in the 20 months that I've been here, just through the S&C programs that we are undertaking. And these are small improvements, and that's not maybe something that you will ever see on the pitch or notice on the pitch, noticeably different from game to game. But it's a big part of again trying to prepare athletes for the challenges of the championship, and he's taken that in a different direction than where it existed before. So we take an approach where we have perhaps more senior leaders in an organization than some of the other championship football clubs, but we empower them to run the area that they are really incredibly knowledgeable about. And so, then when it comes to ultimately myself on the football side, it's bringing those people together, ensuring that everyone's having the right conversations, just as I do on the commercial side or non-football side. But then also, when it comes to the deal making element, then that's where I get more actively involved.
As the youngest current CEO in the EFL, how do you approach perceptions around your experience and what advantages do you feel your perspective brings to QPR?
I don't really think about it. And I don't think I think about it because it's not, for me, it's just about, I know if that I can do a good job and we can all do a good job and we can execute on the plan that our this ownership group has sought us to execute on, then it doesn't really matter. And it certainly doesn't make a massive difference to me in terms of, in boardrooms or EFL board meetings. It's probably the case, though, Connor, that they've probably, when I first turned up at the first EFL board meeting, they were probably like, who the hell is this guy? That is probably the case. But like with everything over time, been fortunate enough to build some really great relationships with the other chief executives of Championship football clubs, and I'm honored to be asked to input on things that impact the league, because I think I've got an interesting perspective to share. So I think in many ways it's actually really, really helpful. Being able to have less of an age gap with the players that we're trying to look after and put in the best possible conditions to succeed sometimes allows me to have insight into a player or be able to connect with a player in a way that other people maybe necessarily couldn't. And then I think, ultimately we all know that in order for the football club to continue to be successful and thrive and add new fans, we need to target a younger audience. And so, again, simply being younger probably means that, again, I have a slightly better understanding of Gen Z, Gen Alpha culture and what, their needs, wants, and things that they're interested in might be. So I think it's been additive and beneficial. And, again, excited about the work that we're doing, but under no illusions about how difficult it's been so far, and that it will continue to be difficult because we have a bold plan, we have to stick to it. And that means there's still going to be some highs and lows, but obviously with the hope that the football club year on year can become more sustainable, can become more stable, and hopefully we can make the fans as proud as possible.
With QPR's use of data, the Brighton-Brentford comparison was drawn once again at the Fan Forum, which you touched on as not being completely accurate. Are there any other clubs globally that you see as good templates or inspiration for QPR going forwards?
Uh, in my last job, a lot of my job was going into different football clubs all over the world and meeting people within those football clubs to understand how they were working, whether a client was looking to buy one of those teams or the client was the club itself, and they were trying to understand how they could optimize or solve certain challenges that they were having across their organizations. So I think it's been really an interesting challenge to bring a lot of all those different bits of information and try to understand how they can be relevant to QPR and how I can use that experience to help the club. I'm really quite insistent on the fact that the most important thing to do when you go into a new place is listen. And we spent about 5, 6 months of just really intimately trying to understand every single department, what heads of departments, things were that they found really challenging and needed help with or wanted support with. Um, and then also obviously, all staff within each department trying to understand their concerns and their views, but also their dreams, and in a kind of more positive way. If you had a blank canvas and everything could start again, what would you want it to look like? And then how can we take steps to try to help achieve that? So for 6 months, we focused on that. And then obviously last summer started to really implement some of the bits and pieces that are critical, I think, to any football club being successful going forward, which is having a culture of how do we put each athlete in the best possible conditions to succeed, but then also each member of staff. So, I don't think necessarily a game model concept would be appropriate for an ownership group with different ambitions that were maybe more, aligned with. We need to try to focus on a specific thing or work season to season and just have goals that are based on the next 12 months or the next 12 months or the next 12 months. We've got a ownership group here that I think the club's very fortunate to have, who are trying to think about the next 5 to 10 years, and that means trying to create a developmental culture in this building where ultimately we are bringing in people who specialize in making certain players or certain people, a certain individual better in a certain way. rather than having probably what has been the historic approach of football, which is you have one coach and he just does everything, and maybe you as an individual player, you learn a couple of things every season, but fundamentally you don't have that level of individualized attention. So I think that's probably the really key concept that I think holistically, unless you're a team in the top, unless you're a top 10 team in the world, and even then, I think that approach will end up being the prevalent and dominant approach. But I think for teams that are thinking medium to long term, that's probably the most individual important thing. And then I think it was probably playing a little bit more internationally on our strengths as a football club, and looking at them less as weaknesses and more opportunities. So if you did a league table of English football right now and you ranked all the London teams, being a kind of the ninth team in London sounds a bit dreary and a bit, like, well, that's a bit intimidating and scary. How on earth are we ever going to become a dominant team? How are we going to get the majority of this city to be interested in QPR? That's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is more that means that we have an opportunity to be more innovative and on the commercial side for sure. We have an opportunity to more specifically try to target different specific generations and get them energized about the football club, especially for people locally who maybe historically have, just as QPR drifted out of the Premier League, begun to support bigger Premier League teams. And also, there are loads of brilliant footballers all over the world, and a lot of them think that QPR as a brand is massive because internationally it is a big deal. And also a lot of people that find being in London, living in London really attractive, and not in the sense of, oh, they just want to have a nice time in London. But we have players from backgrounds that are completely and utterly diverse and all sorts of different experiences. And London is seen as one of the best places in the world internationally to experience. So trying to flip that from a mentality perspective, I think has been important, and play on those strengths. And that's very specific to QPR. Obviously, you couldn't do that with a team anywhere else in the country, or even the fact that we're probably the training ground that is closest to Heathrow. And being able to feel confident as a player that if anything was to ever go wrong, you could fly over to see your family, or your family could come over to see you. So it's trying to elevate the little details that hopefully give us the best possible chance to succeed.
To round us off, what does a good season look like from your perspective in 25-26, both on and off the pitch? And have any tangible targets been set behind the scenes, be that in terms of league position, style of play, or number of academy graduates?
No, I mean, I think we don't look necessarily at the moment over a 12-month period. We look over slightly shorter sprints than that. So the objective between the start of preseason and now was to be in a place where the coaching staff felt that the majority of their ideas were both understood and implemented in possession and out of possession for the first team. And I think, they obviously Julien will maybe tell you one day when you interview him, or in upcoming press conferences. But I think they feel very good that the majority of the squad is in a good place to understand what their football technical expectations are of them this season. Then it's going to be a question about looking in game to game and wanting to be as competitive as possible, and having the belief that this is a football club with a tradition of being able to beat some of the biggest teams in the league recently, and certainly in seasons gone by. And so to have a mentality that ultimately when we step across those white lines, that over a 90-minute game, we can beat anyone in this division, and prepare well and fight to do so. And then when we think more season to season, we want to see players developing and improving, and members of staff developing and improving as well. And if we focus on that, then over a medium to long term period of time, we will be able to see this football club incrementally, hopefully, improve its standing in the championship.
Well, Christian, thank you very much for your time today and all the best for the season ahead.
Thanks, Connor.